My name is Lucía M. Polis. Who the heck am I? I'm the founder and publisher, chief editor, generalissimo of poetry at JLRB Press. Uh, I'm literally, I think, the Dwight Schrute of poetry. I'm obsessed with poetry. Yeah, that's sort of my thing. And that's why I wanted to run this workshop. I did a lot of pedagogy in a variety of positions before in my life. Of course, Hannah, who's here, who's one of my editors here, came up with me in the trenches of the Vancouver Teaching Center, where we both taught ESL and so on and so forth. But poetry pedagogy is a little bit different from other pedagogies. We're going to talk about this in a second and why we've all been taught poetry wrong and what we can do about this. So, quick plug for the press, of course, jlrbpress.ca. And those of you who haven't seen the website, I'm just going to quickly put the website submission in the chat because on July 1st, we're going to have an open submission period for good folks such as yourselves for chapbook length and book length poetry manuscripts. And something to keep in mind. If there's any questions about that, we'll answer them towards the end. There will be a quick Q&A section towards the end. Of course, just as in my notes, plug the anthology. What the hell does that mean? Yes, we just published a lovely anthology called Holes. I guess what I wanted to say is that there are many opportunities to participate in what the press does, and we're always looking for authors. Like to ask oneself what one meant. Anyway, why are we here? Uh, First norms and why we're here. So as we're going to go along, you're going to have questions. I know that probably some of you, like me, might be ADHDers or autistic or otherwise blessed. Type your questions and comments into the chat so that they're recorded and not lost. And then I'll try to address them all as we go along. I'll keep an eye on them, or at the end of the session. In fact, when we're going to start the session in earnest, I'm going to actually start with some of the questions that you've sent in. I'm going to front load some of the things that you wanted me to talk about so that we could address them because I think they're going to serve as a really good baseline for teaching and learning about some of the things we're going to talk about. Ooh, and there is one more person. That's why I wanted to bullshit for just a little bit longer. So type the questions into the chat. When I'm speaking, just keep your mic on mute so everyone can hear and so we can get a good recording. If you do speak, if we're doing a Q&A session towards the end of the meeting, state your name, state your pronouns. Obviously, it goes without saying that we're trying to create a safe and equitable space here. As you know, JLRB Press is primarily and only devoted to publishing poetry by queer, neurodivergent, and emerging voices, right? So we do want to be protective of that space. Obviously, no hateful language or inappropriate language would be tolerated. In case anything does happen that is untowards in any way, see something, say something in the chat also, and we'll deal with it as it comes along. I don't expect anything to happen. You're all good people, but I'm obliged to kind of keep an eye on things as well. So why are we here? One of the things that occurred to me often, constantly actually, as I'm reviewing submissions, as I'm discussing with my lovely editors who are here with us today, actually James, my associate editor, and Hannah's my senior editor. What folks bring to the table when they submit poetry, when they write poetry. And I think personally what emerges for me is this understanding that when we come up in the world, of as readers of poetry, as writers of poetry, it's always thought as something very privileged, something that the English teacher knows how to interpret. These priests and priestesses of literature, right? I think there's a meme floating around where it says something like the author wrote the curtains are blue, and the English teacher says, well, that means the protagonist was sad, and like the actual meaning is that the curtains were fucking blue. And in a way, that sort of notion does play into, I think, this understanding that we are often not taught to interpret and write literature rigorously. I think a lot of us walk away from high school, from middle school, high school, whatever you call it, with the impression that literature is something, first of all, wishy-washy, not grounded in a praxis, not grounded in a science, not grounded in a series of almost rules or precepts that we use to professionalize what we do. And that's untrue. And today, in fact, I'm going to show that if you're not counting syllables, you're not quite doing poetry right. And if you're not paying attention to metrical feet, you're not quite doing poetry right. Because there is an eternal mechanism to how poetry works. And there is something that differentiates poetry from prose. And there is something that makes poetry very special. But whatever it is, It's not wishy-washy. It's not touchy-feely. And even though we get a sense for it, as whatever you call it, Kaizen, the 10,000 hours, when you write sufficient number of poems that you practice it already, some of it might become automatic. Some of it might become second nature. Nonetheless, it's something that you need to be aware of. So whatever I'm going to be talking about, I think the main takeaway for you today will be the question, am I doing whatever we're discussing mindfully? Am I aware of doing that thing we're discussing in my work? Right? Because one of the things that we're going to be talking about is doing things not by accident, right? Poetry does allow what we're going to encounter as and call poetic license, slight distortions, play with language. That's why poetry is not prose, right? But we do need to understand the rules if we are to break them. This adage, I think, does that, right? So, what's going to happen today is that I'm going to wend my way through the questions that some of you have submitted prior to the session that I'm going to weave into my two demos of poems as we go along. And I'm going to discuss some of these questions for a little bit. I'm going to give examples. We're going to actually look at some poems that are going to exemplify some of the things I talk about. And then, after we've covered some of these pre-submitted questions, we're going to look at this self-editing first demo and self-editing second demo. And then we're going to open for Q&A. Does that sound good to everyone? Let's have some thumbs up. All right. Now, the session is called self-editing. Why? The thing is, as editors of poetry, as readers for a press, one thing that very often happens is that we receive the first draft of a poem or an early draft of a poem. Now, we need to talk about the value of drafts and the valences of these drafts. Now, I like to repeat this other adage that we say the job of the first draft is merely to exist, right? And in fact, a lot of us will have trouble starting, actually sitting down, pen to paper, and actually making our vision happen. But once you made it happen, there it is, set it aside, it's done. The problem is it's such an exhaustive process that sometimes people say, this is it, and they submit what they've done. And this is where the work begins at this stage. After you set it aside, so you have gained a sufficient distance from your own work. So you now can see all the words, all the pimples, all the things you might have not noticed before, right? That's what the peer review is also for. People other than you might notice things you haven't noticed, and we might mention it as we go along, right? And that's when you sit down to edit your own work. You sit down to edit your own work before you pass it to someone else. Because what happens if you submit a lot of the submissions we got for the Holes anthology were quite excellent. And sometimes I'm seduced by them. I say, oh, this is quite good. How much of this should I touch, right? And then I have to remind myself, right, that there's also a responsibility here to up-level the author, to help the author reach a new plateau of ability, and to try to show this to the author, how to do this, how to get there, right? The problem is as an editor, and this is something I've been struggling with myself too, and I think this is why we're going to split the editor attached to receiving the submissions, who's going to advocate for the author, and the editor attached to kind of defending the high quality of the finished product, right? But the problem is, right, if the author hasn't done their own editing, now the editor's job is to pick it up for them. And in the best case scenario, we establish a dialogue with the author. And I think when we're not dealing with anthologies, when we are dealing with standalone works, I think this affords us this sort of space in which we negotiate, without losing the author's voice, but also improving it, elucidating it, right? Because what often happens is that the author says, "Oh, that's what I meant," and I always say, "Well, is it in the poem? Is it on the page?" Right? And we're going to talk about that too, right? There's kind of a fine balance that we're trying to strike when we self-edit, in the sense that I would never advocate for giving it away. No, I want you to be a trickster god. That's what poetry is for. You're in poetry, you're writing poetry because you want to mess with people. You want to fuck with their heads a little bit, right? But at the same time, if you do it for the sake of doing it, a little bit too wantonly, a little bit too cavalier fashion, right? You might be at risk of doing it too abstrusely, right? In a way that's accessible either to you or a privileged few, right? So again, one of the jobs of self-editing is to strike that balance, not only between your true voice and the accessible voice, but also to make sure that you can clear a path towards what you're trying to say. You're not maybe taking the reader by the hand. You're not maybe making it easy to penetrate the mysteries of your poem, but you're clearing a path. And how much of that path you clear, of course, is up to you, right? But this is one of the things that self-editing also reveals. In other words, self-editing, what we're going to talk about today, reveals a coherence, your own internal coherence. You know how we say a band has a sound? Well, you as an author have a voice that you might hear recurring throughout your poems, throughout your canon, right? That's the kind of thing that self-editing elucidates. You might want to have different voice in every poem. That's not the point, right? But it shows a degree of a measure of control, a measure of intentionality of your work. And that's what we're here to discuss today. This delicious, hard to pin down stuff. Okay, so now that we've set the stage and welcome the folks who are joining us now, I recognize even more people I know. So now I think we have quite a few authors from the anthology. We have James and Hannah and Jordan and Thomas. And yeah, so that's absolutely lovely to see a mix of new friends and authors we've worked with already. So we're going to proceed to some of the questions that you've posed to me. It's going to seem like kind of a jumble, but I did want to address them first. So first of all, you feel like you got something out of it. And so we could also front load some of these concepts as we approach the poems that we're going to look at. So the first question actually comes from James. So James wrote he wanted to see something discussed related to time management while editing. So one of the things we face with poetry is that you can edit it infinitely. I want to say it was Paul Valéry, but I don't quite remember. He says like poem is never finished, only abandoned, right? Like you can just edit it into nothingness, right? And I've done that, and that's why you do keep versions, right? Okay, you get to version 6 and you whittled it to near nothing. Okay, maybe I need to set it aside, come back to it tomorrow from version 3 and reattempt again, right? So in other words, you have to be mindful of how much of an intervention of your own work you introduce into your poem. So we did say that the job of the first draft or the first edit is only to exist. So the first thing I'm going to say, finish the first edit quickly, right? Like when I used to teach essay writing to undergrads, and the same thing I'm going to say today is that it's almost like vomiting on the page. Blah, this is what I have to say. Put it down. Don't touch it. Don't touch it, right? Because you'll find this is the ironic thing about poetry, right? That it knows better than you what it wants, right? You'll come back to it later. It's like, oh, these images, all these devices, right? That I didn't notice, right? So trust yourself, in terms of putting down what you have. Because the thing is, too, it's always easier to edit down if you have too much material, too many stanzas. And we're going to talk about killing your darlings too, to kind of honing the point of your argument, of your point of your image, right? Then to edit up. If you haven't written enough, it's really hard to come back and recollect the state of mind in which you were to generate that idea, right? And that's why I recommend to over editing in terms of like, or over indulging in the richness of it all for the first draft, right? So finish it quickly. Do not submit the first draft to me, because that's when we're going to have into trouble, because then my job will become to hone it for you. Whereas I want you to have first chance to hone it first. Definitely set it aside. But the problem, of course, is that you have contests to submit to, you have anthologies and stuff like that. Sometimes it doesn't afford. So if you can't set it aside for a day, set it aside for an hour. Go for a walk around the block, right? Because the thing about, I think, Jorge Cham, I know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, he had the comic PhD, Pilot Higher and Deeper. I heard him speak at Waterloo, University of Waterloo, where I did my master's. And he talked about creative procrastination. Now, a lot of you are probably high achievers because you're poets. A lot of you are probably beating yourself up about how much work you do or don't do. The thing about that is your brain is always working on that problem, right? When you're eating, when you're shitting, when you're showering, when you're walking, in the background, after you've written a first draft, your brain is already thinking about how to make it better. You just don't know it. You're just not conscious of it, right? So in other words, don't worry too much about forcing the structure upon the poem at that stage, right? Once you have that draft, once you've settled it on the page, feel free to walk away from it, because your brain is going to be working on it regardless, right? That's, you're a poet, right? That's what you do. Your brain is inured, conditioned to doing this. So don't worry about like, am I going to be able to do this? And another piece of advice, I've been writing this is unimaginable to me, honestly. I'm going to be 43 this year. I've been writing for 28 years, right? There are years and months within these years where nothing happens. and I just let it go. My good friend Rod Moody Corbett used to say to me, enjoy the fallows, the non-productive, the unproductive times of year, right? I don't believe in natural genius. I do believe in the brain being more habituated to certain patterns that will make you a better poet, right? But the quality of your poetry depends on the quality of your investment and the hard work that you're going to do in doing that, right? So, in other words, it's after you've written the first draft, after you've vomited on the page, gloriously, after you set it aside, after you come back to it and put the rigorous time into editing and not over editing, but that's when you've done the work. And that's when you can submit the poem for publication, right? And that's why we're having this talk, because I want to make sure that you do that work to enhance your own work before it reaches the presses, And also we want to make sure that you have some of the skills that I had to derive for myself. It's the most terrifying feeling, honestly. I have this little write-up on my poetry website where I say I have a lot of literary mentors. I have my PhD in English and all that. I don't have a single poetry mentor. I've learned from the poems I admired, from the writers I adored, right? But no one ever sat me down and gave me any wisdom. So I'd like to pay it forward, right? So we'll see how it goes today. Okay, time management while editing. So these are sort of the milestones that you have. First, unbridled edit. Second, edit that's more rigorous. And in the second edit that's more rigorous, I think what's necessary is to look at things like meter, scansion, syllable counts. And that's what I'm going to show you today in the demo, right? And after you've introduced all that rigor into your poem on the second, third, fourth draft, after you're happy with the measures you've added to the poem, then on the final edit, you're going to remove all that. You're going to remove all the markings and annotations from your poem, and then you're going to go by the gut. And then you're going to reintroduce irregularities, things that don't fit the pattern into your poem. And that will be the finishing touch. You add the measure into it, and then you remove the artificialities. You smooth the edges afterwards, right? And that's the approach that's worked for me. Again, a very important caveat is that this is the approach that's worked for me. By dint of your own practice, you're all going to develop your own approaches that are going to be lovely and very, very different from each other. But at their core, they're going to be the same in terms of that initial hyper investment in composition, stepping away, return, rigor, self-editing, setting aside the strictures of it, and then reintroducing the wilderness back into it, right? So at a time, to answer James's question very concretely, I wouldn't spend more than an hour per session, right? Because I think the way the brain works is that it's easy to fall into anything from despair to, bewilderment, like why is it not coming up? Why is it not working out, right? So this is why it's okay to do these edits in stages. For me personally, sometimes I step away for months and I come back and I produce a batch. But I think for starters, you can't quite work on a poem like a lot of other things. You can't quite use the Pomodoro technique because it is a little bit more flighty, right? But I would limit with a timer or something to an hour and check in with yourself. Ask yourself, how do I feel right now? And if the answer is I'm tired, I'm exhausted, that's when you take a break. And then the next draft comes after a break. And the break is maybe a day, 2 days, a week, whatever, right? Because if you don't intersperse your writing with those breaks, right, you don't have a conscious approach to it. All you have is just a hurry to finish it up. James, does this answer your question? Good. So Stuart, oh no, before we get to Stuart's question, another question, excellent question from James, was about killing your darlings. James, what did you mean by the phrase murder puppies? What the heck did you mean by that?
Some people say killing your darlings. Other people say murdering puppies. I
I've
prefer
never
to
heard
say
that
killing
said.
darlings.
I've never ever heard that said. So we're gonna stick with the standard phrase. Hey Douglas, thank you for joining us. Yeah, so killing your darlings. What does it mean, and how is it going to come into the demo that we're going to look at later this afternoon, morning? So in poetry, infinitely less is always more. All right, I'm going to be repeating this over and over again, but a poem, And we're going to get into the weeds sometimes when we talk about things like prose poetry or these intermediate constructs, right? But I think a poem is differentiated from such genres such as prose is because poetry is a capsule. Poetry is a capsule of meaning. Poetry is a capsule of image. Poetry is a capsule of thought, right? And yes, you can have poems strung together into larger things. You can have narrative poetry. You can have epic poetry, but there's exceptions to everything, right? So I think you have to keep thinking about how much of a cognitive load you placed upon the reader, right? You may wish, in fact, to overwhelm the reader with a profusion of images. Sometimes we talk about something we call a poetic catalog, right? When you list things off. Whitman does this, because Walt Whitman, of course, was a reporter during the Civil War, and then he would experience every sort of layer and level of society, all kinds of people that he would encounter, corpses, criminals, and he would list them off to the point that it was almost overbearing. He has this sort of global approach, right? You can do that, but you have to also be measured and controlled about it, right? So I like to also say prose is a meal that can afford like Baroque courses. This is your first course, this is your soup, the salad, this is your entree. Like you cannot be afforded that in poetry. Poetry is like doing drugs. It's the pill that you pop. It's the tab on your tongue, right? Um, Archibald MacLeish says, a poem must be palpable and mute, like globe fruit, right? It's something that's very ineffable because, you swallow that, you go down the rabbit hole to Wonderland, right? But it's not this very long process, You have only a very short time to impart onto your reader this striking image that forms the center of what you're trying to do, right? And as it melts on your tongue, you can make it a slow release pill. You can make it a, fast release pill, but you again have to control how it releases those effects, right? And as a result, I think one of the guiding principles in poetry is that we have to practice an economy of language, right? If you want to be wordy, if you want to be hypotactic with Baroque clauses that fall and flow into one another, you can. If you want to be the opposite, a paratactic and choppy, you can, but you have to be aware that that's what you're doing. And most importantly, in terms of killing your darlings, and I think we're going to definitely see that again in the demo, you have to remove forcefully and kindly to yourself, because these are your darlings, right? Anything that doesn't add to the image, to the idea, to the poem, to what you have at hand. Any stanza, does it detract or does it add, right? You have to remember, those of us who keep the different drafts, you can always keep first draft and come back to first draft. It's not erased. It's not lost. I mean, I did famously 2 years ago, I think, burnt 20 years, 28 years of all my poetry drafts. I just want to keep the last one. It didn't matter anymore, right? I wanted to focus on the present. But for you, for now, it could be fine to focus on what you had before. It's a safety that you can come back to and say, this is where I came from. This is where the poem grew out of, right? This is baby pictures of the poem, the early draft, right? Um, so James, does that answer your question? Excellent. Now we're gonna get really into the weeds. So Stewart sent in a question that asks, how popular are the standard forms, given that free verse is what we all seem to use? An interesting question. And I thought at length about it. So first of all, free verse or ver liber is verse which we think of as no consistent pattern or meter, rhyme, or musicality, which I think is already debatable. When we say it follows the patterns of natural speech. Because, of course, I think actually I have a found poem somewhere comprised entirely of iambic pentameter just found in the wild, because it does occur in the wild. It's called pentametric, right? So that already introduces a certain question into what is natural, what is everyday. And then when we look at the definition of the opposite, is I think it's verse that's ruled by regular meter. So whereas I think vers libre could be something like Ginsberg's. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, right? It's not devoid of meter anyway to begin with, right? But it is kind of like, I mean, Ginsberg is very famous for adopting that Hebraic breath line, that sort of like carries you on and on. It's definitely not to be or not to be, that is the question, right? But we're gonna talk about why that's not sort of cut and dry, right? Whereas Verblanc, like blank verse, of course, we think of as verse with regular meter, unrhymed lines, they typically an iambic pentameter, to which I myself am addicted. That's fine. To be or not to be, that is the question, right? Or my pussy tastes like Pepsi Cola. It's all iambic pentameter, right? So it's also pervasive. So my answer to that, if we asked this question 200 years ago, I think people would say you write poetry in these formal styles because that's how we write poetry. The beauty of whatever comes after postmodernism, if it's new sincerity, if it's not wearing postmodernism on your sleeve and saying, look how clever I'm being with genre, is in hybridity. I think all the best new poetry is somewhere between vers libre and vers blanc, right? And I think it's this notion of whatever fits the situation might work. So I prepared some examples, and I'm probably going to mess it up a little bit, but I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to show a few examples of, I think, very, very influential poems that I think share elements of both, right? So the first one I wanted to show is called American Sonnet for My Past and Future Assassin by Terence Hayes. Now, it's not even a sonnet per se, I think, right, in the traditional Shakespeare. Can everyone see my screen? James? Yeah. So I lock you in an American sonnet that is part prison, part panic closet, a little room and a house set aflame. So it has that sort of like, on the one hand, it has that measure of rhythm, but it's not perfectly regular, right? It's just slightly skewed, right? This one's interesting. And it's funny too, because I wrote a poem that uses this very line from 2001 Space Odyssey, right? My God, it's full of stars by Tracy K. Smith. We like to think of it as parallel to what we know, only bigger. One man against the authorities, right? So the formatting of it, the flow of it, the way it's almost works with normative syntax, right, is all very familiar. But it's no longer that straight-laced classical form. And that's okay, right? Here's another one. This is poems from Olio, and why am I not able to scroll down the page? This is called Hagar in the Wilderness. My God is the living God, God of the impertinent exile. So this is Whitman. This is Ginsberg again, right? But it's not even formatted as this old line. So in other words, Stuart, I think the answer is that you can write in a way that makes sense to you. There is no expectation of having. So Douglas, you're shaking the camera a lot, and my eye keeps following it, and it's really, really hard to talk because of the ADHD. Thank you for keeping it still. There's really no requirement anymore to ask yourself, what is popular, right? I mean, Vikram Seth, I think, and it was a few years ago now, but he took the Onegin stanza from Evgeny Onegin, from Pushkin, right, from the 19th century, and he wrote his own epic poem called The Golden Gate. That uses the same metrical, and it's exacting, just like Pushkin wrote, and that's fine, right? And he's telling his story about his romances in the 80s or the 90s and something. It's transposed to a completely different milieu, and it works, right? So in other words, we're less concerned about what's popular, and we're more concerned with, does the form fit the content? Does the form serve the content, right? Does it work for you, right? When I wrote the epic poem within my last book, The Love of a Good Man, it's very, very iambic, right? Because it does play with kind of a homage to Pale Fire, which is actually Nabokov's exacting, iambic pentameter, 999 lines, loops them to itself. So I didn't make it that exacting, right? And also plays with Prufrock, that is also in places very iambic, right? But it sort of presents a hybridity of both, right? What we're going to encounter, I hope, today is this notion of, I had this professor a long time ago in 2002, John Webb, who called it fortuitous meter and fortuitous rhyme. So think of it as texture when you move through a poem. If your eye catches on some meter that starts entering the scene and then exits it, right? Then that's what I mean when I talk about fortuitous, right? So in other words, it's not heavy-handed. It's not constricted. It's not mandated. One of the things we struggled with James, with one of the submitters to the Holes anthology, he was more obsessed with iambic pentameter than I was. He submitted a poem that was it wasn't quite a sonnet, so it was interesting in the sense that it tried to imitate kind of classical form, right? But it was so slavishly dedicated to iambic pentameter that it had as its insertions a lot of words that were meant to complete the meter, but didn't make any sense for the poem. They were like filler words, right? And that was a great example of where a younger poet was so enamored with the overall form that he, in this case, lost track of how it was serving the overall poem. And he didn't see that it was detracting from it, right? Because he wanted to make the meter perfect. So, Stuart, does that help answer the question that you posed? Yeah. We're going to come back to some of these things again. And I think a follow-up question was, is rhyme still important? If you ask me what the most important things in poetry are to begin with, I will say it's rhythm. It's rhythm. I will be seduced sometimes to say it's imagery, but it's rhythm. So after we prioritize rhythm, I would say I think rhyme and imagery perhaps sit on the second rung, just below. And I think again, we're going to see today this notion of fortuitous rhyme, that rhyme that doesn't necessarily have like an end rhyme. Like, we do have a lot of submissions. Sometimes people write in couplets because that's the thing that we see in grade school and all that, right? And that's fine, right? But I think it's important to step into the slightly more random, the slightly more aleatory, where rhyme is like a flavoring for your poem rather than the main thing that drives it. Unless, of course, you want to have some fun with it. I have a poem, for instance. So one of the things I often recommend to beginner poets or poets who just want to develop their craft is pastiche. Who knows what pastiche is? Hands up. Excellent. Mary, what is pastiche? Let's unmute ourselves.
It is taking pieces from other pieces and putting them together to make your own kind of version of something.
Yeah, I think that's not a bad way of putting it. Thank you. Yeah. I would expand the definition and say it's an artful imitation of another work. Yeah. So it could be taking the meter from another poem, could be taking the images of another poem, could be taking a line from another poem and completing it and using it as a seed for a brand new poem. Ali Blythe does it in Steadfast, I think, his examination of Keats. So I have this one poem called The Birds, where I basically take Ozymandias and I strip and I rip off its entire meter, right? And it's entirely metrical. So instead of I met the traveler from an antique land who said, too vast and trunkless legs of stone, right? I think it goes, I lost the magic gift to conjure words when I with algebra have verified all art. It's not my poem, but it uses this perfect metrical purloin meter from that other thing. And if you know it, it's fun. And if you don't know it, it still works, right? So there's no hard and fast rules, right? I think it's especially important to practice pastiche. Probably in my in the first decade of my writing, it's 80% pastiche. Just so I love using this example, and I often overuse it. But it said that Hunter Thompson once sat at a typewriter and retyped The Great Gatsby because he wanted to feel what writing a great novel felt like on his fingers, right? So that's what you're doing. When you're doing pastiche, you're filtering this intertext through yourself. And you're admitting to yourself that nothing's original, right? I was listening to who's the author of the Lumberjack's Dove? Sorry, she was doing a reading on Instagram yesterday, and she had this one line, and I was like, shit, I almost used this exact line in Love of a Good Man. It sunk into my consciousness, and I somehow paid homage to it. Right? The fact of the matter, like you're never gonna chase, and I'm gonna stop you right here. You don't chase, being original. There's nothing original. There's no urtext. You're always paying homage to what came before. So do it exuberantly, right? Do it exuberantly, do it intentionally, right? So when you do pastiche, I think as a practice, as an exercise, right? I think it exposes a lot of new ways in which you can do poetry. And you do it once and you set it aside. You say, okay, so I've written a sonnet, so I've written a villanelle, so I've written, a Shakespearean soliloquy, and you've had that all under your belt. And when you go to compose your own magnum opus, your own epic, your own collection, right? You have all these different tools, because you can learn all the things you want, and I could teach you like all the different forms, right? But when it really sinks in is when you've really tried these things, right? So this is what I would say, yes, rhyme is absolutely more important, but it's not the only thing that matters. I think we had 3 more questions, 1 from Stuart and 2 from Hannah. And one of the questions was, when is it better not to use commas? Some poems have no commas. How do you decide? Again, so it's interesting. So I've only taken 1 creative writing course, and I've hated it. With John Webb, this one girl kept getting all these A's on her poems, and I kept getting C's, and I was like, "What am I doing wrong?" Well, I didn't marking poems, the whole thing is a mess, right? But the point is, he did give me one good piece of advice, right? He was kind of a kook, but interesting person, right? He says either use full punctuation throughout the poetry or just omit it, right? Because I tried to sit on that fence in my younger days, and you're going to see me doing that actually later, just in a few minutes. We're going to look at 2 poems that I wrote in my 20s, like a long 21 years ago, right? And I think once you realize that line endings and caesuras that come with line breaks and line breaks themselves can act as punctuation, I think it gives you a little bit more freedom to eschew commas, periods, semicolons, and so forth. There's that beautiful play by what's her face? That's called Wit. Sorry, forgetting the author now. The whole play is occupied with whether "and death shall be not proud, death thou shalt die," whether that pause was a semicolon or a comma. It's about a dying English prof, and she's been debating that her entire life. And in fact, that's the way that we approach punctuation in poetry. That I will insist to my dying breath. I think we're discussing with Douglas actually the other day that punctuation is more akin to these pauses and caesuras and breaks and sheet music. And we're going to have a lot of discussion that I don't necessarily want to get into right now, whether poetry is primarily oral or written or whatever, right? But I think when it comes to other people reading a work, right, enunciating your work, while it would be impossible to ensure or guarantee that they'll read it the way you intended, again, it can somewhat constrict the path if you cleverly structure it in such a way that it limits the ways in which it can be read. And this can be said for anything, including sound poetry, that it uses no words at all. So in other words, it's better not to use commas when it's confusing, when there's like no other punctuation, suddenly there's a few commas in the line. And the inconsistency will confuse readers, right? And there's this interesting effect that we could again talk about for a long time. There's you reading poetry off the page if you literally look at the words and read them out loud. But there's also this notion of the voice inside the head that we don't talk about. And I forget the scientific term, and it's a whole discussion for another day. And it's an interesting effect that a reader could be reading the poem internally and to get stuck. You know how you read something out loud and it suddenly makes sense, right? Or you read it off the page, it might not, right? You want to make sure that when someone's reading it out loud for themselves and on the page, in their mind, should be more or less the same, right? Why you can't guarantee it, you should make sure that there's no like 5 different ways of reading the same thing, unless this is how you've designed it and you want it to be purposely confusing, right? So in other words, it's not about commas, it's about consistency. It doesn't very often work to make things kind of a combination of both. But if you do write in a more normative syntax, where you have like a capital letter that starts a sentence and a sentence that enjambs and runs across lines, then you have a variety of pauses available to you, where the period is the longest pause, the semicolon is the second longest, the comma is the third longest. And the punctuation there stops having the same weight as it does in normative grammar, in normative syntax. Like, there will be places where I would still say, well, it's a poem, but it's still a comma splice. Because you've kind of like, you're kind of munging two sentences, like together, basically, or 2 clauses together, right? But in poetry, you'll find, and this is the main takeaway for this idea here, right? The punctuation serves more of a notational value rather than a grammatical value. Although the grammatical value is still there, but I would prioritize it a little bit lower, right? And I like to think of poetry as a notation for a mental or individual reading, kind of like consumption of poetry, solitary consumption, but also a notation for potential performance, right? This is a question I want you to grapple with for the rest of your lives. Is my poetry meant to be performed? Is it not? I mean, I can tell you what your approximate trajectory will be, because the first decade you'll write for yourself. then you'll be shy, then you'll go to your first open mic, then you'll read, and then you'll realize that the actual act of enunciation changes the way you think about your poetry. Maybe it changes the way you edit your poetry, right? But so I don't want to necessarily, like be overbearing in terms of like the way I instruct you on this, right? All I'm going to say is that the poetry must have internal consistency. And if it's the logic of dreams, so be it, right? Okay. And to that extent, Hannah asked, and I think the question was what we could discuss, and Hannah said line breaks. So there are only ever two reasons to break a line. When it's overlong and throws a stanza off kilter, or when the form can better serve the content. Never break a line too much for dramatic effect, right? I would say maximum of twice per poem. That's what I will permit you, right? Otherwise, poems on Instagram sound like William Shatner is talking like this. Everything is choppy, and people think this is really cool poetry, right? I mean, I guess that's how the Beats would read their stuff in a really choppy way, right? But the point is, I wouldn't break things for dramatic effect. The drama has to come from the words themselves, from the way they carry your images, from the way they carry the narrative in the poem, right? So definitely don't break lines based on feeling. It's about the structure of the line in the poem. And I will show you some possible approaches in a demo that's just coming up, right? But the line break acts as punctuation. Breaking grammar rules, the last question. When can you break the grammar rules? And then I'm going to take a sip of water. So the strange thing that I'm going to recommend is that you write the first draft of your poem following as many normative grammar rules as necessary, especially if you do set it aside and come back to it a few weeks later. You're going to say, what the heck did I mean? If it's all, I mean, if you can even read your handwriting. So I think it's important to have that first grammatically normative draft so that it opens up for a variety of possibilities for subsequent editing. Because if the first draft is abstract, I mean, it's okay to write down abstract images on the margin, right? And do little call outs and annotate your draft, right? But I think you need to show yourself the possibilities in the kind of edits that you can perform on your poem. And for that reason, I think it's very, very important to know what these rules are. So I'm not going to go all over them, but like watch where your splices are. Watch how many subjects you have. Watch how you actually structure the sentence that breaks across different lines, and so on and so forth, right? And only after you've written the first draft in those ways, on that third, fourth draft, I think on average, by the way, this is a question that has been asked to me: how many drafts should I write? If you find yourself writing 8 drafts, something's wrong, right? You probably need to take a longer break from your poem. You probably need to reassess if there's one poem in your draft or 2 poems that need to be broken apart, right? So after you've done that work and you're ready to put the finishing touches on your poem, then you go and you break those rules. And that, and only then in the final process, can it be driven by feeling. So now I'm going to self-consciously take a drink of water. We're going to take a deep breath. I'm not kidding. Take a deep breath with me. Ready? 3, 2, 1. Because I got to blabber on a bunch more now. Okay. How's everyone feeling? I need to see a thumbs up if you're feeling good. Are we feeling good? Okay. Very good. Okay, so in the self-editing demo, we're going to look at 2 poems, both written a crazy amount of time ago, 21 years ago. And I purposefully wanted to pick something that was very distant from the way I write right now, so I could have that objectivity. So I could be kind to myself the same way I try to be kind to the younger or the more beginner submitters, and to try to show the same kind of input. So let me try to share my desktop and to move the thing with floating faces off to the side. and then look at my website. So I think I'm going to read you this poem first to kind of give you a sense of what it is, and then we're going to go into the actual taking apart of things. This is a poem I wrote about. I think it was a protest of the war in Iraq in 2003. And this is the first Kappelbaum poem I wrote. Kappelbaum is, of course, a purloined alter ego from Stanley Cooperman, who was an American poet who moved to Canada in 1970s, was very involved in the Victoria poetry scene and the SFP poetry scene, shot himself in the early 70s, and left this inexplicable collection of books that he's written, right? I stole his very first book from the Isaac Walban Jewish Public Library in Vancouver, and that was sort of near the beginning of my poetic career. Cannibals, his book. And in that book, yes, I will magnify the screen. Thank you. And in that book, there's a collection of poems involving Kappelbaum. So Kappelbaum is, in fact, a persona, a defamiliarization. Instead of saying I, he's his Kappelbaum, right? So he's dead already. So that's I took his thing. So I'm going to read you the poem just to give you a sense of what it is. Listen to it. Think about it as if you're an editor, as if it is your poem, right? And try to think what in it orally or aurally, aurally, works for you and what doesn't, right? And then we're going to look at the metrical portion of it first. So, Kappelbaum's protest. It's morning, and Kappelbaum is shaking on a bus downtown. There's that comment. He's like, we'll talk about it. Between a painfully fashionable youth and a Chinese lady with groceries, Kappelbaum winces. It's too early for groceries. The shortest distance between 2 points is a place to be on a morning like this. Arriving at gate 5 to the downtown, Kappelbaum loses his spirit and breaks. His city is gone, and the white tufts of its grandmother's hair hanging dejectedly to the left, right, and roundabout. The Granville Street arc moving in the waters. Kappelbaum walks to his favorite stretch. Pornography stores and 99-cent pizzerias turn to staked-out landmarks. Everything runs the course in the approach path to the library square, seeing the pitiful discord of someone's remote catharsis, standing between lawyers against war and mothers for peace. Kappelbaum feels like a fish out of water, left on the gutting table, innards aghast by the power of a telephone call. Clutching his individuality, Kappelbaum walks on through the city's business district in ruins, among a veiled disposition of ignorance, no shiver of hope, and double-edged maxims and slogans. Kappelbaum, swayed by the crowd, walks on. Okay. Is it a good poem? It has promise. Is it a terrible poem? Not necessarily. Let's see what we can do with it. How many people here are familiar with metrical feet? See a show of hands. Okay. If you're not familiar, thank you. Familiar with metrical feet, you need to become familiar with metrical feet. Yes, and the Wikipedia article, I think, is a good, thank you, article to start with, right? Now, if you're asking me which metrical feet should I be familiar with, I would select these ones, right? The disyllables and the first 5 of the trisyllables, right? I don't think I ever talk about the Cretic or the Antibacchus or the Molossus, right? They all exist, right? And some of them exist in other languages too. There's always like some form in French or in Russian that uses these. But when we're going to be talking about these things are things you should know, right? So this little thing, this U-shaped thing, indicates an unstressed syllable. And this line thing, which I notate personally as a slash, that's how I've been taught, but whatever, indicates a stressed syllable. So of course, if we talk about to be or not to be, that is the question. It would be to be or not to be. That is the question. That's an extra syllable there, right? So it's not perfect anything, an extra syllable, right? And this is what we talk about when we talk about scansion. We'll look at how many metrical feet there are. And you say, unstressed, stressed. What the fuck is that? It's an iamb. So, and how many of those are there? Well, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Penta. 5, it's iambic pentameter. And that's what it means, right? I'll let you read on this on your own time. But metrical feet are essential in you understanding your own poetry. And this might seem now like a chore, or Lucía is telling us to do all this math on poetry. Yes, I am, because poetry is rigor and poetry is science. And it sounds like a pain in the ass first. And I don't know if it's one of those things, like Vonnegut says, you don't have to be crazy to work here, but it helps, right? Like to be obsessed with like the way your poetry works, right? But let's look at it, right? So what I've done is I've performed, I don't want to explain too much the metrical feet work, but I did perform analysis on the first page of the poem, right? And I will note that this poem now, today, to me, all these years later, seems overlong. It's 78 lines. In my edit, I think I made it 33. And I want to show you how I got there. So in this particular poem, I want to show you how to handle meter. In other words, how to handle rhythm. So let's first of all see how the person who was then known as Michael K handled this poem. So it's morning and Kappelbaum is shaking on a bus downtown. So it's interesting already. So it's morning is shaking. You can see some interesting effects, not necessarily bad. You can identify some parallel structures that you would say, okay, keep, right? Like if you're not aware of them, you can't say that this is a repeated, structure, right? But basically here, you can detect these patterns, right? And it's actually not bad that you have like two iambs, but you have an anapest and an iamb. So it's just kind of a growth, right? So like and Kappelbaum on a bus downtown. So actually the first stanza is not bad. But right away from the second stanza, we see that young Michael K is not paying attention to meter, is not paying attention to rhythm. Because while he is obviously introducing a lot of iambics, because we already said iambics are very natural to the English language, right? He's not in control of the poem. Between it could be between a painfully, or it could be between a painful. Well, no, actually, it doesn't have to be like that. Sorry, between painfully fashionable youth and a Chinese lady with groceries, right? So there's no rhyme or reason here, right? So there is kind of a parallel structure between the three iambics here and the two iambs here, but what's the design here? I can't make any sense of this, right? This line now is interesting, right? Because here we can tie fashionable to Kappelbaum winces. Fashionable. Kappelbaum winces, right? So this and this is an interesting parallel, right? But in itself, the scansion doesn't yet reveal any pattern. It's too early for, it's too early for groceries, right? Again, that's not bad. We can claim that with groceries, for groceries, that sort of rank repetition actually works really well, right? But so far, it kind of like really draws out the meter of the poem, right? And by the way, this is precisely the sort of Shatner-esque thing, typesetting that I talked about, right? Like I don't write like this anymore. It's morning and Kappelbaum is shaking on a bus downtown, right? Like in my mind, it seemed like it was really dramatic and poetic. But actually, I don't yet think that the form yet best serves the function of the poem. The shortest distance between 2 points is a place to be on a morning like this, right? So again, suddenly we have a stanza that works a little bit better, right? Because there are now parallel. See, the way poetry works is by creating callbacks, right? You create parallel structures or structures that mirror each other, and you can think of them as sort of like rhythmical rhyme, right? Like if you have some iambics and some anapests here and anapests there, one will recall the other. In other words, right? But still, it doesn't answer the question, what the hell do we do with this stanza, right? So as I point out here, so there are certain stanzas that work and certain stanzas that do not, right? So, and right away, I think my initial assessment as a self-editor, because right now the hat I've put on is that of a self-editor, not of a poetry editor. I'm not yet editing for submission. I'm editing myself. Is that number one, I think the poem is overlong. Number two, there are stanzas where the rhythmical pattern does match the stanza and it works well. But there's certain things that don't work. Like what purpose does the comma serve here? It's morning and Kappelbaum is shaking on a bus, comma, downtown. Now, worse yet, years later, I started using like two spaces to indicate a comma, which kind of worked, but was kind of awkward, right? So I said, okay, damn it, I will not use a comma, but I would use kind of a space to indicate that. So honestly, if it's going to go that far, just do normative, grammar, just do normative syntax, and take away the inconsistency of it, right? So it didn't make sense to me in retrospect. Like, why is that there? Why is that there? And I'll show you how we can improve this, right? But I'm not talking about it like fixing, because I don't think this poem is broken. I just think it's a poem of a young person who's just trying to put this idea across, this disillusionment with people protesting for the wrong reasons. But we're going to get to this, right? So yeah, I thought the stanza was a kind of a jumble of I am, stroke keys, and anapes, right? So this is the first hint as self-editors that we might possibly want to make the lines longer. Because when we make the lines longer, those patterns where we have those repeated metrical feet might elucidate themselves a little bit better. And I'll show you how that works in the second draft, right? Another thing I might mention from time to time is that very often connectors can be omitted. Like, and that's part of poetic license, like, fanboys, for, and, not, but, or, yet, so, throw them out the window, prepositions, articles, very often, because you're prioritizing meter, you're prioritizing rhythm, right? You don't necessarily need this. But for now, what's interesting is that this is a fully formed sentence. It's morning and Kappelbaum is shaking on a bus that, I don't know. I still don't know whether there's a comma there. Downtown, between a painfully fashionable youth and a Chinese lady with groceries. Yeah. And yet it's at odds with itself, because even though it's, aside from that comma, a fully formed sentence, why is it formatted the way it is? Why does it begin with a capital letter? Why is every time we're starting a new idea, it sort of starts a new stanza, but there are no identifiable breaks, right? One of the things I point out here, and I think I pointed out for some of you in the anthology, right, is that if you start, every stanza that starts a new idea has to be set off in some way. You might like typographically set it off way to the right or play with the way the words are on the page, right? But it's too early for groceries. The short is, whoa. No. Like, I've added an extra line here, right? It's too early for groceries. Breath. The shortest distance, right? So we started a new line. So like this is kind of a run-on sentence, right? In a way, this poem just runs on and on. I did like this stanza very much, because in the rhythmic analysis, I thought the interplay between the iambic lines and the anapestic lines, like is the place to be, on a morning like this, right? So you see, if you combine on a morning like this and is the place to be, I think they become more stronger in parallel, right? But then we get to the point where, aside from the rhythm, there's certain things, speaking of killing one's darlings, that I don't think are really necessary, right? Because, okay, arriving in gate 5 to downtown, Kappelbaum loses spirit and breaks, the city's gone the white dove. So this speaks to the idea of disappointment, right? Of some sort of dejection, right? But why say it? Very often I would say to an author, show, don't tell. Don't tell me how to feel about it. Don't tell me how I should be feeling about it. Paint me a picture so poignant that it should be obvious for me how to feel. Maybe I will not feel about it exactly as you do, but you would direct me to it, right? So it kind of feels like I'm saying the same thing, or that Michael K is saying the same thing twice here, right? He loses his spirits and break, the city is gone. There's some sort of like transformation where he's not in the physical place anymore. Where Kappelbaum, the speaker, or the protagonist, I should say, is because he's not the same as the narrator, of course. The protagonist is not seeing reality. He's derealized, defamiliarized here. Certain things do work. I did like the white tufts of his grandmother's hair, right? There was kind of a nice little break in there that did work for me, right? And it's kind of enjambment, not even between lines, but between stanzas, which I thought was quite masterful, right? And the question here is one of trade-off. Speaking of killing one's darlings, right? Because what actually is being described, if I recall correctly, there used to be, I think, like a clover leaf on Seymour, where I actually lived for a time as a Yale-Time yuppie, where that I'm actually describing imagistically to the left, right, and roundabout, right? But what's more important here? To keep this geographical description of no one but me. It's a private. When we talk about symbolism, we talk about public symbolism. That would be immediately obvious to everyone, right? Like the hammer and sickle, the swastika, the red star, and this, which is very private. If I didn't explicate it to you, you wouldn't know, right? So what's more important, to keep it here as a principle, or to perhaps remove it, deprioritize it, in favor of an image that might be stronger for the poem overall? And that's kind of the question I was grappling with at midnight last night, as you can see from my comments. Okay, you didn't see anything. Okay, so as I mentioned before, we're continuing with this problem that structurally the poem it refuses to separate into ideas. This is not the only way to do this. I'm personally a fan of stanzas and substanzas, but this is not the only way to do this. You can play with typography in a number of ways, right? But by grouping lines into pairs, triplets, quadruplets, right, and then grouping related stanzas, it often helps, I think, group meaning and allow you to transition from one section of the poem that says one thing to another section. Here's a good example where I think the poem structurally is overlong and a little bit problematic. So there's some interesting images like gate 5 and approach path are obviously like airport images, where like the metaphor being constructed is that Kaplan is feeling like he's departing somewhere. He's traveling somewhere, he's moving somewhere, right? It's some sort of form of flight, right? But the first image is mentioned, and a lot of time passes, and then the second image is mentioned, right? And that delay weakens the metaphor because like it needs to catch a lot sooner for us as readers as we go on. Again, I think this is telling the reader how to feel. This is, young Michael K. expressing disappointment with lawyers against war, mothers for peace. I think he sees a little hypocrisy in it, right? Why say that? Paint a picture that's poignant for the reader. Don't digest it. Don't regurgitate it, right? This was just curious. And there was a film, I think, called Maelstrom, where that begins with talking fish. Its head is, I think, chopped off and it's left on the cutting block. And I think I borrowed that image. I don't know why I'm mentioning it, whatever. And again, there's certain things that only a 20-year-old could write, clutching his individuality, right? That doesn't need to be said. Paint it for me, is what I would say to young Michael K., right? And I thought that by here, like, this is where the poem, this is kind of like middling, like cringe lord stuff, among a veiled disposition of ignorance, no shiver hope in double-edged maxims. No. We got to finesse this. So let's give it a shot. So we're talking about a few things here. We're talking about structure, and we're talking about self-editing for meter, for separation of ideas, and for condensing, encapsulating of ideas so that they carry your purpose forward. So let's have a look at the second draft, at the rewrite. Kapelbaum's Protest Redux, a horrifying number of years later. So let me read you this version. It's morning, and Kapelbaum is shaking on a bus heading downtown. Between a youth painfully fashionable, a Chinese lady with groceries. Kapelbaum winces. It's too early for groceries. The shortest distance between 2 points is a place to be on a morning like this. Arriving at gate 5 to the downtown, Kapelbaum's city is dawn and the white tufts of his grandmother's hair. The Granville Street arc moves in the waters. Kapelbaum walks to his favorite stretch of pornography in 99-cent pizzerias. On the approach path to Library Square, he knows the discord of someone's remote catharsis. Kapelbaum is a fish on the gutting table, enters aghast by a telephone call. And now he walks on through the city's business district in ruins. In these slogans, no shiver of hope. Kapelbaum, swayed by the crowd, walks on. Now, the first thing you notice, I should hope, I want to hope, is that this is a much more condensed, encapsulated, compacted poem, right? I'm no longer giving you a novel of ideas, right? I'm trying to condense that day in 2003, right? And this is the reason it's still fresh in my mind, because I've written the poem, right? And now we need to make it even more effective. So the rhythm is more compact, but there's some aleatory, some fortuitous effects are generating. And we have to be careful and gentle with ourselves to not throw out the baby with the bathwater. For instance, I thought it was interesting that shaking and heading formed kind of a little something mellifluous there, right? And Kapelbaum is shaking on a bus, heading downtown. It's kind of a slight repetition of that kind of worked all of a sudden, right? And this is how I thought it so happens that in this case, these triplets seem to sort of do the job. And as we reach the end, you have this pair that sets it apart. And I think that's good for a conclusion, right? But that's not the only way to do this. I could have formed them in different things, but I kind of tried to preserve this visual structure of the poem and not erase, Michael K's voice. And I think I somewhat succeeded, right? This is a good example, right? So like if we look at it before in the way it was formed, where is it? Kapelbaum walks to his favorite stretch, pornography stores, 99-cent pizzerias, turn to state. I have no idea what this means, right? Like, I think I was talking about the gentrification of Granville, right? But like, who knows, right? So like, and that wasn't the point, right? And there's a little bit of stylization here. This is poetic license. I like to run words together, so I playfully point out this poetic license. That's fine, right? But like, I've condensed the image, right? Kapelbaum walks to his favorite stretch of pornography in 99 cent pizzerias. And you notice that's kind of a metaphorical flight, favorite stretch of pornography. a favorite stretch of, like a street or something like that. So it's transposed, it's poetically, changed. Already here, I'm taking a little bit license, but it's okay. I don't think you're going to oppose because I already condensed the image. It's more palatable to you this way, I would argue. Another idea that was simplified and sharpened, right? Like I didn't want to list things off that wouldn't make sense to anyone 20 years later. I simply say on the approach path to Library Square, he notes the discord of someone's remote catharsis. It's already pretty encoded. When we talk about poetry, we talk about encoding. If you've put something very personal, but never provided a key, that means it's encoded. And this is as far as I would take it here, right? Because if I would take it further, it would again become a private symbolism that would then make no sense. It would provide no inroads for your reader, for my reader, Michael K's reader, right? Again, an image that was shortened and simplified because I really liked it then. Fine, let's keep it now. Kaffelbaum was a fish on the gutting table, enters a gasp by a telephone call. Whereas here was a lot more complicated. It was like Kaffelbaum feels like a fish out of water, left on the gutting table. And there's like the idiom, there's like the image, it's far too complicated. It doesn't need to be so complicated. Kill your darlings. And I guess per James, murder your puppies. No, it's such a weird image, Okay, so I don't know why I didn't commit this. Business is in ruins. And I think, again, all the cringe lord stuff, we're taking it out, right? So like the veiled disposition of ignorance, no shiver of hope, and double-edged maxim and slogan. No, there's none of that, right? We've painted the picture, right? We said that Kaffelbaum is a fish on the gutting table. And by the way, there's an interesting slippage here because over here I said something like Kaffelbaum feels like a fish out of water. And I think personally, a metaphor is always stronger than a simile because here I say Kaffelbaum is a fish on the gutting table. And that equation, like personifies, immediately puts the protagonist right in that like embodied like flapping being there, right? Regardless, near the end, it's nothing about clutching his individuality, this little image, but it's about letting the reader digest what happened. This is basically from the observation that happens is from here to here. Like you wouldn't necessarily know that when I say the Granville Street arc moves in the water, I'm talking about, or Michael K is talking about like the street being literally so filled with people that it seems like a sea, right? But it kind of gives you an inroads and maybe understanding this, right? Because the title says Kappelman's protest, right? So the point is from here to here, this is basically what I'm saying. I will trust the reader to themselves digest, to themselves regurgitate the images I've presented. And now I can say Kappelbaum, swayed by the crowd, walks on. You're left to make your own conclusions. I'm not spoon-feeding a meaning. I'm not spoon-feeding a feeling, right? You're making your own meaning out of here. I'm trusting you as a reader. And that's what 20 years of poetry or, writing affords, almost 30 actually, right? The differentiation there. Because here, I've done editing, so much editing. This is probably the 5th draft, right? But I've still worn my things on my sleeve. My feelings, my thoughts, my observations, right? And here I try to condition it and make it into art. And finally, after I've introduced the rigor into the poem, I take a little bit out. So this is the final edit, and that's already at 1:36 a.m. You haven't seen that. Okay, so in yellow, we see highlighted the pattern breaking. The getting away from the formalism, right? So here, there's no syllabification, there's no metrication, there's no scansion, right? I'm purely going what fits and what doesn't. And I'm changing my mind about some things. Let's read it now. It's morning, and Kappelbaum shakes on a bus heading downtown. Between a youth, painfully fashionable, a Chinese lady with groceries. Kappelbaum winces. It's too early for groceries. The shortest distance between 2 points is the place to be on a morning like this. Arriving at Gate 5 to the downtown, Kappelbaum's city is gone and the white tufts of his grandmother's hair. The Granville Street arc slowly rocks in the waters. Kappelbaum walks to the favorite stretch of dirty pigs and 99-cent pizzerias. On the approach path to Library Square, he notes the familiar notes of some person's remote catharsis. Kappelbaum has now become fish on the gutting table, enters a gasp by a telephone call, and now he walks on through the city's business district in ruins, and these slogans, no shiver of hope. Kappelbaum, swayed by the crowd, walks on. So, I'm still on the fence about a couple of these things. I'll probably, now that I've rewritten it and I have to re-put it on the website, I still will make a few adjustments, right? But I looked at it and I was like shaking, heading, okay, well, maybe in the final reading, we can get away from that, right? But definitely I had to come back. This is why we keep previous edits, right? Because that idea of Kapelbaum winces standing on its own line had to be on its own line, because that's the observational frame of thinking about it like film. This is like pan over to here and then pan over to Kapelbaum. Kapelbaum winces, right? I realized, well, yeah, it's clever for it to be a triplet, but it has to stand on its own, right? Here, the image for me was insufficient, moves in the waters. It's kind of biblical, but I wanted slowly rocks in the waters. I'm still not necessarily convinced that rocks is the one, but I wanted to kind of show this waterbound swaying, right? I don't know about dirty pics. Now I have maybe I want to keep favorite sexual pornography, damn poetry. Anyway, I did like the play of notes, the familiar notes. That's me taking liberty to play with it, the verb and the noun, why not? Because what did I have here? He notes the discord. It kind of felt like a little bit rhythmically unformed, right? Like he notes the familiar notes, has that sort of aleatory, that's accidental kind of finishing touch that I think worked for me a lot more. And I think I'm a lot closer here. This is probably 98% of the way there. And honestly, I kind of surprised myself. I was working late last night. I was like, can I do it? Can I prepare for the seminar? But yeah, because I'm following my method for 28 years. There's no exceptions, right? So in other words, this is what we did with this poem. So we've talked about meter. We talked about structure. Now I'm going to take another sip of water and we're going to take another deep breath and we're going to look at syllable counts and line lengths. Phew. I'm going to lose my voice at this stage. All right, and once again, when you take in a deep breath, hold it in. We're going to do square breathing. I'm going to hold it in for 4 seconds. Ready? All right. Another poem from the same period. It's dedicated to Don Wood, who is the man who introduced me to American poetry. In fact, introduced me to literature. Don Wood is a fantastic person. He woke up one day, he was a construction worker. Then he decided to get a master's and start teaching English. And he was the most ragtag, inspirational person in my life, probably. In a way, it's a note to him for encouraging me in my early 20s, right? And it actually has appeared in my very first then self-published collection called Granville that I'm going to actually reissue next year on its 20th anniversary. My God, that time flies. So this poem is called Ode to Neon. And we're actually going to see how this poem, and this one is for Stuart. Where is Stuart here? Damn it, Stuart left. Well, anyway, we're going to show, per Stuart's question, how this poem might actually be served by a more classical structure, and how we can preserve almost entirely the sound and the meter of the poem, but change that internal voice on the page, that might occur as a result of grief. They took your lover's pearls to work them in a frame of drinking nights, inside glass lengths of crystal tubing, each drop milky white. See, this is where instead of using a comma, I started using this doubled space. It's so awkward. I could experimentally do it, right? At the time, it seemed like the right thing with the knowledge that I had, right? But this time, I would suggest maybe it's a hint you need normative structure, normative grammar here. Each drop milky white glistened on the table, so that in slicing the eye, they were able to make their work an art. It shriveled in the light before it burst, collected in petri dishes. The pearl lay liquid, gas, waiting for customers' wishes, soon to come. XXX, 99 cents, open 24/7, all the same, really. Rude, honest, speaking freely. The new frontiersman wears a bit of rainbow on his sleeve. Twisted smiles bow down to ignorance's liege. Noblesse oblige. Sunday parks, helium, the dissonance of comic books with passionless crime. Radon, xenon, krypton, argon, neon make empty rhyme and pretty looks. On nights when I sense loss of moral strength, cut down to size, I suck your love out of glass lengths with my eyes. All right, so let's look at this poem. Something you need to start doing in conjunction to analyzing your poetry with meter and scansion is counting the syllables in each line. And yes, it is a pain in the ass. And yes, this is what makes your poem infinitely better. What this reveals is the patterns in your poetry, the way the poem expands and contracts. Poetry breathes, right? You must have seen poems in which lines might stick out like a sore thumb. Sometimes it's done well and purposefully, sometimes it's done by accident. Why? Because of the syllable count, right? And in fact, if we look at, very infamously long lines, so like, where's Song of Myself, right? We need to ask ourselves why these things work, right? And for Whitman, in fact, he's very mindful of this liltic, again, Hebraic thing. There's this kind of long lineage of people who read the King James Version Bible, right? And the Song of Songs. And so we, as a result, you get the King James Version, you get Whitman, you get Ginsburg, Elizabeth Smart, So I celebrate myself and sing myself on what I assume you shall assume for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. This is the Hebraic incantatory thing, right? Do you want it? Maybe. But you need to condition it, right? Or not, depending on what you're doing. So, in other words, they took your lover's pearls to work them in a frame. So it's interesting because sometimes young Michael K hits it and sometimes he misses, right? And we can see this obviously a design. This is 6 syllables long. This is 6 syllables long. This is 4 syllables long. There's a comma there. This is 4 syllables long, right? But again, while we can see kind of a shortening, like a contraction and expansion of the stanza, there's no rhyme or reason in stanza 2. There's no rhyme or reason in stanza 3, right? This is actually an almost normative, kind of rhythmical poem arranged in this way, right? And while I see the reason for it, because that was the overall form that I was experimenting with at the time, there's actually no reason for it to support the contents of the poem, right? So let's see what we can do with this poem without disrupting its voice. So we can debate whether or not every line needs to be capitalized. That's the old-fashioned way, and it's more about typography and publishing than anything else, right? I could have capitalized every line just for the heck of it, like the way you might see in Shakespeare, sonnets, whatever. So that doesn't matter. What matters is it normative grammar or not? So basically, what's interesting is that a lot of these lines are already inherently pentrometric, and some of them are either near perfect or perfect iambic pentameter as they stand when put together on a line. They took your lover's pearls to work them. There's only one syllable missing, right? So it's nine syllables, almost perfect iambic pentameter. But it's interesting that we derive 9 syllables, 9 syllables, 9 syllables, right? Just by arranging these words closer together on lines, we get these more structured approaches. They took your lover's pearls to work them in a frame of drinking nights, inside glass lengths of crystal tubing. Each drop milky white glistened on the table, so that in slicing the eye, they were able to make their work an art. I'm not going to read it on because it's basically the same. What's interesting here is that I'm using commas properly, right? Right, for the first time, unlike that other case, the first poem we looked at, where commas should be eschewed because it's demanded by the structure, right? This is my opportunity to use commas as these notational elements to provide these pauses, these caesuras, these breaks that provide proper breath for the reader or the internal reader, right? Or the actual pause is slowing down of the image, right? The perlate liquid, gas, because like what I'm doing here is that I'm actually using line endings. But if I can't do it consistently, if I have to resort to these fake ass spaces in terms of commas, and sometimes like line breaks, right? It's a jumble. And that's a hint to move towards a traditional form where I simply say the perlate liquid, comma, gas, comma, waiting for customers' wishes, right? I try to play with, in retrospect, I kind of like how it mimics the actual sign, but also poetically, why write poetry if you're just going to do verisimilitude? So I played with doing the XXX 99 cents and running with things. That's like my personal style. That's perfectly fine. That doesn't matter, right? What matters is how I've arranged the lengths of the syllables, right? Check this out. 999, 998. When I consider like one syllable difference is basically the same, right? So as far as these concerned, these are equal in length. In these stanzas, this is what I call the mirror pairing, right? It goes 10, 11, 9, 8, 9, 10. So it contracts and it expands. I designed it to breathe in this way, right? Whereas in this stanza, we go from longer to shorter and longer to shorter. So these are parallel, mirror, parallel, and parallel, right? So in other words, like I'm doing an actual conscious, self-aware, mindful design in my poem. This is not blown together by wind. This is not accidental, right? And this is my opportunity to try new things, right? to actually use quotation marks, as if I'm like quoting something that's like being written as if it's said on the sign, right? I get to use M dashes, which by the way take no spaces on either side, whereas N dashes do. We can talk about punctuation another time, right? And I'm basically using and taking advantage of all the punctuation that I couldn't because I rejected it then and therefore had to try to be consistent, you know? And it more or less works. So let's call out a few things that, yes, Milky White here. I mean, like, I'll admit, I don't think anyone's ever asked me before, but this is a very sexual poem, you know, and I think it speaks to little Michael K's latent, what he thought of as latent homosexuality now. Like, she's a lot more complex, right? But it's kind of a clever way to put something you're tentative about and kind of hide it in there a little bit, right? You know, like, who knows? You know, I suck your love out of glass lengths with my eyes. There's something erotic there, something unspoken, even though we are talking about neon signs lining the constantly gentrifying Granville Street, right? So it's an interesting play with images, right? This line, perfect iambic pentameter, is shriveled in the light before it bursts. That never changed from the original. We just changed the line. It shriveled in the line before it burst. That was the mirror image. These were the mimicry of the same ones. 998, 1098. This is where I actually do the opposite. If you're going to do like a freed up postmodernist arrangement of the poems, you're at liberty to omit prepositions, conjunctions, articles, whatever. If you're going to come the other way back because you need the punctuation, you'd better put all that stuff back in, right? And that's why, you know, like I added in Sunday Parks and helium or dissonance, right? Because I need those extra syllables, you know, to make the rhythm and length work. I think, like in many other cases, and maybe this is my own personal style, this is my own personal flourish, you know, I do like the last stanza to somehow stand apart from the first stanza, but these are also from the same period, so it's hard to tell why I did this, right? And that's why I go 1099, 883. And this is a good example, though, of needing to write more rather than less. Because yes, I could write additional verbiage, but it would already not be true to what I wrote in 2003. So you overwrite. So you write more than you need to for your first draft, so you can cut down because you can't cut it. And then you have a little naughty cliffhanger that kind of establishes the metaphor on many levels. But that's not even it. We proceed to the final draft, to the pattern breaking. And honestly, what's interesting is that I did very little. You know, I changed very little, right? So what I did is I read it and I was like, okay, well, I understand 999 is very beautiful, but this is where I have to catch myself in my obsessions and not be like a submitter who's obsessed with iambic pentameter. Yes, it's no longer going to be 9, 9, and 9 syllables long. But when I read it, they took your lover's pearls to work them in a frame of drinking nights, inside glass lengths of whistle tubing. It only makes sense to put inside on the next line, right? And you could argue if the jam carries you over. For me personally, it made more sense there. And that's why you always introduce a stricture first, and then you wipe it away, you know, where you need, not like not thoroughly, you know, just only when you need, right? What was the deal with each drop? Yeah, the same thing I think was with each drop. You know, I think it was more important for me to begin the substanza or the stanza within the grouping of stanza with a new idea, right? I could have connected it, you know, because I could have said that, you know, each drop could have continued here, but it felt like this stanza or this portion of a stanza grouping already had a complete idea. And I wanted to make sure that the next full stanza also contained a complete idea, right? And that's why I moved each drop back there. And they were able, and the same thing here, right? I actually made it a little bit longer so that in slicing the eye, I think that's a reference to the Andalusian dog, the Salvador Dali film where they pretend to cut a slice of a woman's eye off. It's actually cow's eye. In slicing an eye, they were able to make the work an art, right? And I think the only thing I added was the comma to make it a properly constrained clause. It shriveled in the light before it burst, collected as it was in petri dishes, right? So let's read it now. They took your lover's pearls to work them in a frame of drinking nights, inside glass lengths of crystal tubing. Each drop, milky white, glistened on the table so that in slicing the eye, they were able to make their work an art. It shriveled in the light before it burst, collected as it was in petri dishes. The pearlade liquid gas, waiting for customers' wishes soon to come. XXX, 99 cents, open 24/7, all the same, really. Rude, honest, speaking freely. The new frontiersman wears a bitter rainbow on his sleeve. Twisted smiles bow down to ignorance's liege, noblesse oblige, and Sunday parks and helium or dissonance of comic books with passionless crime, radon, xenon, krypton, argon, neon make empty rhyme, but pretty looks. On nights where I sense loss of moral strength, cut down to size, I suck your love out of glass lengths with my eyes. Now, what happens in me reading? I already caught one possible error. That's why you have to read your poems out loud. To ignorance's least, noblesse oblige. Obviously, the joke is that these are noble gases, and of course, the idea of noblesse oblige is that the nobility has to serve in the military if they are nobility, right? So that was like kind of the play on that there. But now as I'm reading it, maybe it needs to stand apart. The noblesse oblige, and Sunday parks and helium lies dissonance of comic books with passionless crime, something like this, right? So even reading out loud, I'm like, something's not quite right? So there you go. So again, I'm 98% of the way there, but probably there'd be another edit in the works there. That doesn't matter. The important thing is that we looked at three important effects in practice. And before we go into the questions, which will be in just a moment, I'll just remind you what they are. You have to look at the metrical feet in your poem, right? In the beginning, it will be a matter of sitting down and painstakingly analyzing it, right? And scansion is a little bit difficult at first because there will be cases where there are 2 or 3 different ways to scan a poem. And that's fine, right? As long as you're aware of the patterns you're creating in there. At the same time, counting the syllabic length of lines, right? Sometimes these things that you do will come to you naturally, right? And you'll in your mind will have already counted, and that's fine. I'm not necessarily advocating like this slavish obedience or like performing it every time. This is just a framework to do maybe occasionally, to familiarize yourself with, to pay attention to where the stanzas break and how you're introducing new ideas. Are there sufficient breaks? How are you using these commas and periods and semicolons to introduce new lines? Which format is best suited for your poem? This more classical and sort of like more syntactically well-formed structure that kind of allows you to use more punctuational elements, or a structure that's a little bit more liberated, but then demands that you don't fudge it, with other inserts, that there's no punctuation. And the line break itself is your punctuation. So this is basically it. I think really 80% of the things I showed you today already puts you over the line over all these people who submit poetry but don't do the self-editing that you're now aware of. So that's it for today. I know it's a lot. Let's take a little bit of time to ask questions. Now, Douglas is still here. So Douglas has one question in chat. So I'm going to answer that question. I'm going to ask you for other questions. So Douglas says, rhythm wins, I understand, but surely one can't edit imagery after rhythm without disrupting the rhythm. So edit imagery and rhyme first and do rhythm work as a final step. I do think that's the case, Douglas. I think you have to establish what it is. Thank you, Anne. I think you have to establish what it is you're trying to show before you finesse the sound of it, right? And again, it might happen that you're sort of diving deep into it and you're like, whoa, that's not what I wanted to do. Then you do have to go back to that first draft and maybe kind of divert yourself, 2 paths divert in a yellow wood, like you can't travel both, you travel one at a time and you see which poem it takes you there, right? But I think you're definitely correct in saying that you have to clarify. I wouldn't necessarily say edit the imagery, right? Because you could finesse the way you show imagery later on and decide how much you let us feel, how much you let us think, how much you think and feel for us, right? But you should for yourself be certain of what the imagery should want to show in the poem before you start putting the finishing touches for sound. Because you are right, and it'll make it very difficult to make the structures of meter and any sort of accidental or intentional rhyme or like these breath lines, this length, the structure later on if you haven't done it. Yep, it's an excellent question. Okay, now who wants to go next in terms of asking questions? Who would like to ask? Yes, Mary.
So in terms of murdering puppies and killing our favorites, so for these 2 poems that you just walked through, what do you think is the main point or the meaning of each of these poems that you kind of stripped everything else away of, if you had to summarize it for each one of these two?
You want me to tell you what the poems mean?
Well, no.
Sorry, what's the question? I apologize, Mary. What is the question?
So like, especially in the first one, when you removed so much from it,
Mhm.
like which things were you really honing into? Like, how did you decide which?
Oh, okay. Sorry. Again, I apologize if my head is not fully here. It's a lot for me too. I see. My idea, of course, was to basically paint this notion of, I guess, in retrospect, a young person who is interested in injustice, but is also unhappy about hypocrisy, right? And I think in cutting things down, the idea was, can I still show that this Kapelbaum character that represents Michael K is in fact, very interested in showing up, but is at the same time disappointed by the kind of things that he sees. And so I think the removal was guided by the idea, can I still explain that Kapelbaum is moving through his favorite place, which is Bramble Street, that's still ungentrified, that's still authentic, with the pornography stores and the pizzerias and everything, right? And at the same time, it stands in contrast with people who seem pretentious, who, unlike these authentic places, are actually very put on in, I guess, what you might call these days virtue signaling, right? Or, so in that case, the meaning, the pursuit of the preservation of meaning was predicated on asking, is it still clear that we've shown the struggle that Kapelbaum, the character, undergoes? Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that's helpful. Thanks. I also liked with that poem how when you removed like the names of the specific groups that were protesting, how that opened it up to other interpretation. Like I can relate that to walking to Washington Square Park in New York City and like the TikTok crowd that has shown up to do marketing there. Like it kind of expands it to all sorts of different gentrification.
You make a very essential point, that the more you remove, the more you abstract the experience to other people's experiences. And the more you make it specific to like your own place, the more you remove that potentiality, right? So if I don't mention some of the street names, I don't mention other things, people might actually relate more. You might actually end up succeeding in making it more universal. So you kind of try and strike a balance there, because you are on the one hand, or I was on the one hand, describing a time and place and space, right? And on the other hand, you obviously want other people to relate to this and say, I too have a struggle with this, maybe, right? So you make a good point. Like there is, I think, a good point in asking how much you preserve of the locative. There's this poet, Peter Cully, that lived almost near where I live in Nanaimo, right? He was very interested in the locative, right? And kind of like talking about like Nanaimo or like, this mid Vancouver Island, almost as if it were like somewhere in Europe, somewhere just imbued with culture and art, like in a way that I don't often see people talking about a place like Nanaimo, right? But he abstracted, right? He leaves these little hints, where you might recognize a parkway, like these aspects of the city, right? But it doesn't hard code them, right? Because it leaves it to interpretation, to universalize it by other people's experience, other readers' experience. Excellent question. Other questions, please.
Lucia,
Mm-hmm.
do you find that, you focus on all these pieces in revision and that you now do them naturally when you're composing, or are you still a person who starts with, does that process post creation?
Excellent question. Don't try to write and edit at the same time. I tried that. It doesn't work. You tend to second guess your decisions, right? A lot of those beautiful things that need to exist in the first draft, but might not survive the first draft, would never be put down the page, would not even have a chance if you start editing as you're writing. So you do have to somehow find it in yourself to separate the self-editorial mind from the composing mind. And I think there's something to be said for editing on the page. As it happens, I'm in an epic mood these days. I'm writing a new epic right now. I'm not quite sure what it's going to become. I've written 3 cantos. We'll see where it takes me, right? And I find that actually editing on the page, where with each subsequent edit, I actually use different inks so I can tell which edit it was, and I add different things. It's a lot more natural to actually see these plasts, these historical additions and subtractions, for me to go back and to write stat, like don't change it, keep what it had before, or keep going, right? So in other words, I can still be of 2 minds. Like the metaphor I like to use is playing chess against yourself, where you make a move, you pretend you're someone else, you turn the board, and make another move, right? It's almost like you have to try, I think, to put on that slight pretense that you don't know these tricks, only tricks I taught you today, right? And I think, thank you, Thomas. Take care. Thank you for coming. But I think the point is that this is why James's question about timing is so very important. You're not going to have the opportunity to play the editor if you've constrained your writing time. If you said, you know what, I have an hour, I got to sit down and bang it out. And if you're in that mode that you're going to write, and you're going to devote yourself to writing rather than second guessing yourself, I think it's going to help to just sit down, headphones on, whatever you need to do, and just focus on getting the words out. Remember that whole like vomiting on a page, getting it out, right? You're going to have no time for editing, right? And if you find yourself doing that, stop and get yourself out of that mindset, because you make an excellent point. You cannot do both things at the same time. It's not the same process, because the process of composition, I think, and it's a whole other kettle of fish, but it's a process of retrieving. See, I do it. I like to tell people that there's kind of a heuristic and algorithmic way of doing it. As an ADHD or as an autistic, I collect images literally in a file, and I actually advise it to a lot of people to do it this way, because I don't believe in genius. I believe in collecting your experiences and moving through life, collecting images, experiences, sounds, right? And then returning to them and seeing how they might fit, right? And if you do that, you can actually make it, you can actually liberate yourself from this idea of being inspired. You come back to the material that you have and you work on it with the rigor that you've developed. And this rigor is more about retrieval and connectivity. And that's the process. And that's so different from the process of identifying patterns and correction. Yeah. Other questions? Very good.
Can I ask, have you done this workshop type presentation before? And if you have, are the things you're teaching and the way you're showing them changing? Or you've got got the pieces nailed down, or how this curriculum has evolved for you over time?
This is the first time I've led this in a seminar. I've taught a lot of people how to write poetry, but I think this is the first time that I sat down and thought about the rigor of my approach. And I think in considering my approach, I thought about what are the elements that have served me well. And these would be things like the syllabic counts, the scansion, but then also thought about what are the things that obsessively consume me that I didn't tell you about, that I'm a little bit afraid of telling you about, but you have to promise me to not be consumed by them yourself. One good example would be in the year of our Lord-defying spaghetti monster, 2005, I was taught about the golden ratio by Lee Johnson, incredible professor of the Romantics. From that day onward, I started to build the golden ratio into every poem that I write. A prime, B. If you archaeologically dig up my poems years later, you'll find it in there, right? And that's the sort of stuff I decided I would not teach people about, because they develop their own tics, their own obsessions, their own praxis, right? But what I realized, what was most important, what I think allowed me to put together this presentation, which I think I will continue doing on a periodic basis, and revisiting different pieces of mine to kind of because it's always humbling to take one's own work. And like I said, to show oneself that sort of kindness, and sort of to show the humility of us all starting from a very sort of emotional-based place, not rigorous, not methodically driven, and sort of moving towards a personal practice and a personal method, right? This is a good question. And I would say as this probably is going to evolve, I'm probably going to look some more into talking about techniques of identifying other little elements in one's writing that might be surprising to folks, right? For instance, we didn't really talk about different types of rhyme, but there's a lot that has to be said for accidental rhyme, you know, that people very often disregard or throw out. There's a lot that has to be said for parallelism, alliteration, a lot of little elements that people are not aware of. But again, you have to notice that I try to be as not heavy-handed in this as possible because I come from big A academia, I'm a PhD in English, I lectured. And one thing you find if you take that sort of rigor, sometimes that turns a lot of people off, I kind of wanted to show in many ways that the science of poetry is equal parts natural. And so it has a measure to it. It has a logic to it. But at the same time, it's not so hard that only a select few can do it. It's accessible to everyone. Does that answer your question, Douglas? I hope it does. Okay. We will have
I'm a little slow on the draw. Thank you very much.
Oh, no worries. All right. One final question from anybody, and then we'll call it a day.
Please invite us to round 2 or the sequel.
Absolutely. Will do. I will open my cards. One of the intentions, last mini spiel before we say goodbye for today. One of my intentions was, in fact, to gather some of the folks that have contributed to the whole anthology, because I felt that this was a great opportunity to get together a cohort. Thank you, James, of people who have sort of worked unwittingly on the same book, but also might submit in the future, and people who have worked together with us and therefore might have impetus to, I want to encourage other people to continue writing, continue submitting. And also we've put it out on, we advertised the event broadly to have people we've never met before to kind of come in and to see that poetry is not necessarily a scary thing. I mean, if one thing is true, and why I think if it worked for you today, I think it worked for me, is that if we've demystified poetry, if we made it seem that there's actually a good reason for why certain things work and certain other things don't work, if you walk away from this with a renewed sense of trying something new in your poetry or thinking about something, then I'm really happy about that. So how do we feel at the end of this session? Yes, that's a good question. I will try to upload this for everyone to see on the website. We'll put a new section that'll be called Learn or something like that, and we will have a compendium of things. And also, I will encourage you to email me other subjects of discussion, including other topics for webinars, other things that interest you personally. They will all be, I'm like speaking in the best voice, I will consider all of them for future talks. And we'll obviously think also about inviting other folks to do things. I'm already considering inviting some anthology contributors who are some of the more accomplished anthology contributors to talk about their work. I'm thinking about inviting some of our editors. I know Hannah for a while has been considering talking about the poetry box, the sort of poetry as a kind of almost like a life experience, like a life practice. Maybe we'll work with James on protest poetry. Who knows, right? So there's a lot of opportunities here. And I'm glad that for our first seminar as JLRB Press, this has worked out. So ultimately, I thank you all for attending so well. Actually, we got a tremendous showing, like a full class worth of people. I'm very happy that you were here with me. The questions you asked, the way we discussed things, the way we've digested it together. For the anthology authors that came and stayed, I'm just really happy you took part in this journey with us. We're going to have new journeys, coming up with new anthologies and of course, don't forget, July 1st, open submission period. Send in those poems. And if you don't think you're ready, send in those poems because you get feedback every time. And you're going to be ready for next time. Send in those poems. Thank you very much. Thank you for being great listeners. Thank you for your patience. And we'll see you when you see it. Take care, friends.